In the shifting state of the world that makes tragedies more visible, some people create to help others understand. This week, join me, Zach Walsh, as I talk with Brian about his game Sapience, a space opera that emphasizes what it means to be a part of something that's larger than yourself, the cruelties of oppression. Welcome to Schedule for Launch, a podcast to discuss projects you may have missed. I'm really excited to be talking about this one today because we've had some back and forth conversation trying to schedule you in here. But I have Brian here to talk about his new tabletop role-playing game, Sapience. Hi, Brian. Good afternoon where you are.
G'day. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's the afternoon of Sunday here, so we're in the future.
It's the evening here. There's a 16-hour time difference right now.
It's not a great day.
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm glad you could come on.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Oh, I'm excited too. So can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, Brian?
Sure. Yep. I mean, very typical story, I guess, for a lot of role players. I got into role playing at a very, very young age. I think in the early '80s, which will age me a little bit. With those old choose your own adventure books that TSR put out. I think Pillars of Pentagon was the first one I ever had, and
I think that's the one I read too.
Yeah, it was a good book in its day, and the Fighting Fantasy game books, which were obviously very popular through the '80s. And from there, yeah. I think that year for Christmas I was given the Magenta Basic D&D set, which I think came out that year about 82 or something.
Okay.
Got into role playing through Dungeons and Dragons, and moved up through the editions, and over the years, man, I mean, I've been role playing for a long time, and I've played a hell of a lot of games out there. Love it. Have always loved it. I've done a bit of writing here and there for role playing. I was published by Pinnacle back in the day for Deadlands.
Oh wow!
A few articles in their lines, in the Deadlands line. And then I met a guy called Jake Norwood who wrote the Riddle of Steel RPG, which some of your listeners may have heard of. It's a bit obscure these days, and I wrote 3 source books for the Riddle of Steel, The Flower of Battle of Beasts and Men, and a companion book. And they were all self-published by Jake. This was back in the days before print on demand, so it was a fairly expensive prospect to self-publish. So I don't think there are thousands of copies out there. But the first day I walked into a game store in Sydney, Australia, and saw my book on the shelf, I was pretty excited. That was pretty cool.
So you're really a veteran of this, then?
Well, I wouldn't say veteran. I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, Sapience will be the first time that I'm. Well, I mean, I've written a lot of other stuff that's obviously I've never even tried to publish, but
yeah,
Sapience will be the first thing that's entirely mine that I'm publishing, and hoping that people will find something to like in it.
I think there's a lot to like in this game. You sent me a short document about Sapience, and I'm waiting for that thing to go so I can back it because it just looks great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it'll be. The Kickstarter will have started, I guess, by the time people are hearing this. But for me, it starts in 3 days, and I'm getting excited and a bit nervous,
Yeah, of course. So before we get too far into just discussing and talking around it, what is Sapience?
So Sapience is my. I've always thought that good stories, the best stories, have layers, right? We can enjoy a movie or a book or a game or whatever for itself, but also if there's multiple layers and it makes you think, and holds up a mirror to our world so that you can kind of see aspects of the real world through the kind of allegory of the game, and it allows you to explore things without having to maybe confront them head on, right? I mean, George Lucas wrote Star Wars as a response to America entering the Vietnam War. That was what the original concept of Star Wars was, right? And Planet of the Apes was all about how people often use religion to prop up inequality and justify it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think good stories do that, and I think science fiction especially is really good at doing that. So Sapience, I mean, there's different facets to Sapience, but a big part of it for me was holding up that mirror and having a look at our society as it stands. And I think certainly in the last few years, our society has been with a lot of discrimination, a lot of,
It's been a really sad time for us.
it's been a sad time for a very long time. I think people are becoming more aware of it,
Yes, that's what I mean.
perhaps through social media changes and things like that. And really, Sapience for me was a way of kind of holding that up and illustrating it in the setting. I'll tell you very briefly a little bit about the setting. It's a science fiction setting. It's set in a completely separate cluster of stars that people have colonized by traveling there in centuries-long sleeper ships. And the humans there have uplifted some animals from Earth to Sapience, right? So there's gorillas and orangutans and octopuses and dolphins, and they've all been given intelligence. And a lot of humans really think, well, we made them intelligent, so they owe us, right? There's a lot of discrimination in some parts of the setting. They're literally treated as slaves. There are gorilla soldiers with shock collars to keep them in line and things like that. And then in other parts of space, there's shades of grey between them, and but where people think, well, these other species, they're sapient, they're just like us, they should be free. So there's very much almost a North and South American Civil War kind of feel to the setting, and the idea is to explore perhaps in that grey area between those two extremes and be able to have a look at the kind of discrimination and privilege that exists in that society, and if that makes people think about our own society, then at the end of the day, that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. There's a lot to this game, and a lot of the pre-written stuff that you put in sets it up for this very cool space opera where people can explore that dark mirror-esque kind of thing that you brought up there.
Yeah. And yet at the same time, that's not going to be to everybody's taste. And as you say, the trapping is a space opera. Sort of specifically, it's the Sword and Planet subgenre, if you like, which is usually sort of people talk about Edgar Rice Burroughs and John Carter of Mars, and that's the sort of subgenre of, well, it's a science fiction setting, but there's a reasonably good reason why people are running around with swords anyway. Star Wars obviously was sort of playing from the same playbook, and so some groups will really love the kind of dark mirror aspects that we just talked about, and other groups will say, hey, what we really want tonight is I want to play a cool story where I'm an ape and you're an octopus and we're flying around through space, and the setting, it's a very old setting. There are these ruins from an old civilization that vanished long before the humans arrived, and
yeah,
there's a sort of native species there that really suspiciously look a lot like old Earth legends of goblins and things, and we don't really know what's going on with them, and they've got kind of some weird kind of, science fiction often has your sort of magic in the form of psionics and things like that, so there's a little bit of that in the game as well.
So you brought it up actually a little bit earlier, and I think a lot of people will be interested in that. Outside of the one alien race, players will be making characters that are intelligent animals. What made you take that approach instead of just aliens out there?
I thought it was an interesting concept to explore. It's a little bit less common. I think there are 1,100 games out there that have taken Star Wars or Star Trek, ethos isn't the right word, the concept of, hey, every planet's going to have its own sapient species, and they're all going to look like humans but with bumpy foreheads or wrinkly noses, and that doesn't really work for me. But more, I think it was, as I said, I wanted to explore a theme, and the theme was one of this kind of inherent privilege, right? And we all we don't like to talk about it, but in our own society, there's a lot of privilege, mostly white privilege, male privilege,
Yeah.
affluent privilege, right? So if you're an affluent white guy, you're at the top of that pyramid, or at least you might think that you're at the top of that pyramid. Um,
Hmm.
so that would be a harder concept to explore in a setting where there's just a whole bunch of alien races, because why would one person's not necessarily going to inherently think themselves better than another species
Yeah.
that they've just met. But if it's a species that's only intelligent because you gave them intelligence, or at least your ancestors did, this is set hundreds of years after that happened,
Hmm.
that allows that justification, that very real justification that exists in our world, for other reasons that I'm hinting at, but I'm not going to outright say because it's an unpleasant
Yeah.
subject. And that's kind of the ethos that I want to explore. And you can play a human in the setting as well.
Hmm.
But yes, primarily the character types, as I said before, you've got your orangutans and gorillas and octopuses. And also, just to sort of throw an extra wrinkle in all of that, while there's all this conversation going on about, well, I'm just as intelligent as you, I'm sapient, why don't I have the same rights as you? Well, very recently in the setting, AI has been developed, and it was developed by orangutan scientists, not by human scientists, which the
Oh.
humans aren't that happy about. And they're intelligent, right? And now all the same questions are coming up, but it's around biological sapience versus mechanical sapience. And even the people who last week were saying, hey, a gorilla's got every bit as much rights as I do, that same person this week might be saying, yeah, but I really like these androids that I own. Oh, well, it doesn't matter because they're only machines. And so there's the extra sort of question of, well, they're sapient too, but we built them. Is that the same as uplifting them? Is that so? I've tried to sort of put different layers of things for people to explore in there around that. And you can play an android character as well.
There's a lot of depth to that I think a lot of people will appreciate. On the same side, though, when you sent me the document, you've also included what I guess I'll call the grit scale. That's really good for telling people that they don't need to lean into that. So I think having that right in the material is great for the people who are listening to this or who find Sapience who are looking for the gorilla with a big sword in space motif.
Yeah, and that's something that, as you said, and there's more about that in the GM chapter as well that I haven't quite finished yet, so I didn't send to you. Most of the book's currently with my editor. But there's a lot of information in there about how to have that discussion with your group, because I think these kinds of themes are things that may disturb some people, they may be triggers for some people,
Hmm.
and it's certainly not something that you would want to spring on players.
No, it's definitely
Right.
not.
Very famous podcast recently ended because of something that the GM threw on one of the players that was particularly ick. I imagine you know what I'm talking about. You have to have conversations between GMs and players. Your group have to enter into a not necessarily a physical contract that people sign or anything like that, but there has to be a social contract about what's acceptable and what's not. And I
Yeah.
have a lot of advice. I hope good advice in the book about how to introduce that, how to discuss that with your group. There's a bit of that in the bit that you've read as well,
Yeah.
and ideas about well, if you just want to touch on things, here's some ideas about the sorts of themes that you can start to introduce. But if you want to get more serious, here's some of these other ideas. Um, yeah, and so I think different groups hopefully will be able to get different things out of it.
Yeah. Let's step back from the actual lore and setting of this game, because even though that's super interesting, I'd like to talk a little bit about the mechanics of this. You have created a very cool dice system, or at least it's something that I haven't seen before, where you're basically drawing dice blindly. Could you kind of explain a little bit about the dice system, how it works?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I hope it's engaging. I haven't seen anything like it before. The concept, as you said, the concept of the die system is you have three attributes. They've got their own names, but we'll call them mind, body, and social, if you like.
Okay.
And your levels of the attributes determine the dice that you will put into your die bag. So you use different colored d6s. So I'll have, I might have three red dice because my vigor is 3. That's my body stat, if you like, and I might have 5 blue dice because my presence stat is 5, and so forth. So you'll have 10 or 11 dice in your die pool of among these 3 different characters.
Okay.
3 different attributes. All of your skills are rated from novice to master, but it boils down to 1 to 6.
Okay.
So when you're going to make a skill check, if I've got a skill with 4 dice and something, I'll reach into my bag, but I won't look at the dice when I grab them, and I'll take 4 dice. So the idea is I'm going to roll them. So I'm going to get a random result on the dice, but I'm also going to have random colors that I've drawn out of the bag. Now the attributes that I have higher, I'm going to be more likely to get dice of that color out. So that's kind of how a strong character is going to tend to be better at physical skills, because they're more likely to draw out those red dice that relate to that attribute.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're getting two completely different results from the one roll. So there's a die pool success system, right? The d6s, every 4, 5, 6 is a success. That's pretty simple. You can glance at a bunch of dice you've just rolled and see that very quickly how many of them got a 4 or higher, and that determines what's called your effort. And your effort is used to determine whether you've succeeded in a roll, and that'll be compared against a static difficulty level or your opponent's effort if it's an opposed roll. You also determine your focus, which is the number of dice that you happen to pull that match the attribute that the skill is linked to. So if I'm doing a physical skill, it's going to be linked to my vigor attribute, which is the physical attribute, right? So the number of dice that I've drawn out for that will determine my focus. And focus can be used, there's a few different ways you can use focus, but the primary way you use it is to modify your usage of the skill. So every skill is a verb, right? I'm running, or I'm jumping, or I'm shooting, or I'm whatever.
Yeah.
And what focus lets you do is it lets you apply an adverb. So I might say I'm going to use my focus to do my skill quickly. And the amount of focus that you have will then speed up. So if I was, I don't know, picking a lock or running across the room, focus allows me to do that faster. Or maybe I'll be doing something carefully, which will have some other benefit, or I'll be doing it in combat. I might be doing it violently, and it will add to my damage. There's a good section of advice in the book about, and we break down a lot of the real common adverbs, things like carefully, quietly, right? So rather than doing if you're trying to sneak up behind someone, you'll do a movement roll, or you might do an attack roll, and you can assign your focus to doing it quietly, so other people and the target won't hear you doing it, that kind of thing. That's the primary use of focus, and it really allows you, it really breaks out that skill system so that you can, whatever you want to be doing in the moment, you can modify what you're doing it using focus. And there's advice in there for allowing players to come up with pretty much any adverb they can think of that they could assign to the situation and say, hey, this is the way I'm going to modify what I'm doing. And so it really, I hope, and in playtesting, it adds to the kind of narrative feel of the game, of being able to modify what you're doing in the moment in a way that suits what you really want the character to be doing.
That's super cool. So to roughly sum it up, it's how you do something and how you make it better, really.
Yeah, that's right. Or how you modify it. That's right. And then actually what I think's a cool thing of the system, and that I've had really excellent feedback. I don't use. It's still a role-playing game. There's still combat, and you can still get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have hit points. You don't keep track of this is how many wounds I have. Instead, as you get injured, you add black dice into your die pool, and black dice represent wounds. So the next time I do a skill check and I'm reaching into my bag and I pull out my handful of dice that I'm rolling, well, any black dice that I happen to have pulled out, I don't get to roll those. So they don't generate effort, and they're not going to generate focus because they're not going to be the right color anyway. So the more injured you are, the more black dice you have in the pool, the less the harder it starts to get to succeed in things. And it's a really, well, I like to think it's a pretty slick way of kind of handling that mechanic of the more hurt you get, the harder it is to succeed in things. This would be a good time to go and get some healing, or whatever, so that you can get those black dice back out of your pool.
It's really one of the coolest dice systems that I've seen, and you've explained it
Oh,
so
thanks,
well,
man.
even in the simple character setup and book that you sent me. It's only roughly 25 pages, and a lot of it seems like it's thoughts, and it's was so simple for me to grasp how to do it, and I thought it was so interesting, and to me it was kind of like a how hasn't this been done before?
Yeah, well, I figured. I mean, I had a few people say to me, "Oh, look, why aren't you just using, you know,
Hmm.
whatever XYZ system?" And there's something to using an existing system when you're trying to tell a story, and I can't really claim that the system is heavily tied to the setting or the theme
No.
as some very few games manage that. I mean, the original Deadlands, you drew it was Wild West, and you'd draw poker hands to cast spells, and you'd use poker
Yeah.
chips and things, and so it was the setting and the theme were very much tied in with the system. I can't claim that here, but what I can say is I think it's an interesting system. I think it aids narrative play. It's not heavily crunchy, but it does have a little bit of crunch to supply to
Hmm.
satisfy simulationist players. It's got so it kind of sits in the middle between you know GNS theory. You've got your narrative games and your sort of simulationist games, and I think it sits in the middle there. Hopefully, at a level where it will engage people on both sides of that spectrum
Hmm.
to get some pleasure out of it. And I think I mean, not to toot my own horn, but I think it's a pretty slick system, and I'm pretty proud of it. I think it's come out really well.
I think you should be. This is something we talked about right before coming on, was that you wanted to do something that kind of focused on creating a great story, kind of like some of these other sci-fis that clearly you grew up with and you loved a lot and have inspired Sapiens. And I think this system, compared to others especially, really lends to that.
Thank you. Yeah, oh, I'm pleased to hear that.
So there is something in this that kind of helps guide that narrative play, and you've dubbed it the four axes. Could you kind of tell us a little bit about the four axes and what exactly they are?
Yeah, so Sapience was, and this is something I discuss in the introduction to the book, which I know a lot of people won't bother reading, but I hope they'll go back and people want to get into the meat of something when they grab it. That's absolutely fine. But I dedicate a chunk of the introduction to why I made the game and what how it came together. And yes, so the four axis, the idea behind that is these are the four elements that bring Sapience together into its whole, if you like. And one of them is what we've already sort of discussed, is the themes around discrimination and privilege
Yeah.
and so forth. I won't go back over those.
Hmm.
Another one is as you say, I grew up with science fiction. I've been a Star Trek fan and a Star Wars fan, and my whole life. And Star Trek. I mean, I'm not going to go into the whole Star Trek versus Star Wars
No.
argument, but Star Trek has an awesome feel, but it's a it's a very
Hopeful.
safe, hopeful kind of a feel. There's no, I think, as I said in the introduction, there's no problem that can't be solved in the space of like an hour-long episode, right?
Hmm.
It's a civilization that's eliminated poverty, and there's no want because everybody's got a replicator and so forth. Star Wars has a much more frontier feel. It's old, it's gritty, it's you've got the technology. Nobody even thinks too much about the tech. Nobody knows how a lightsaber. Well, I guess some Jedi know how a lightsaber works, but people use technology without necessarily understanding how they use the technology, which is not really sort of the case in Star Trek.
Yeah.
It's got that kind of more gritty feel. You've got this weird place with all these different aliens and single biome worlds that really make absolutely no sense if you logically think about them, but they're kind of cool, right? Could you really
Yeah.
have an entire planet that was one city? No, that wouldn't work at all. But that's fine because it's a game, or in that case, it's a movie, uh, and that's okay, and we can kind of ignore and hand wave those things away. So there's that kind of feel in there of that kind of old sci-fi, and as I said before, it's the kind of sword and planet gritty feel to the setting, and that also kind of maps in with, you know, when you look at science fiction like Firefly and The Expanse, and even Star Wars, when you're talking sort of Han and Chewie and so forth, there's this real kind of concept of the ship is our home, right? And all of the crew of the ship are a family, and this is where we live. And the ship's probably falling apart because we could never afford to fully maintain it. And we're flying around, we're trading, we're exploring, we're maybe doing a bit of smuggling when times get tight. We're doing whatever we have to do to stay alive, and this is our home and this is our place. And I'm trying to evoke that feel in Sapience as well. Gene Roddenberry called it the wagon train to the stars, right?
Oh, I love that.
Obviously talking about Star Trek in that case, but that's that kind of concept and feel that I'm going for. And the fourth one is it's Apes in Space, right? It's I've been a fan of Planet of the Apes since the original. You maniacs! You blew it all to hell! Back in the original. That might be a spoiler, but I think the statute of limitations might have expired.
I think it's old enough.
Yeah. Planet of the Apes was just this fundamental thing for me when I was a kid. I loved those movies, and the new most recent ones with Caesar as the chimpanzee who led all the other apes through, the Andy Serkis character, was very a different slant on the same story with obviously a lot better special effects. But I just love that kind of subgenre where it's not just here's this alien race that we gave it three noses, and here's this other one, and this one's got three breasts, and here's another one, and it's got a tail and it's green. We're taking the familiar and we're kind of uplifting it. We're saying, okay, so let's explore. Let's have apes. Let's have android. You have to call them androids, by the way. You can't say droid because George Lucas copyrighted that word for some bizarre reason, so we have to say android.
Yeah.
Octopuses, which I found out after I'd already written the book, and I had to go back and change the entire book because octopi is not correct, apparently. And you can't say octopi. It's not
really?
A word. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Whoops.
And you can't say octopode either. both of those are incorrect. It's octopuses, which really annoyed me because it threw out bits of the book that were size-based. But anyway, it's not something that's often done in science fiction, and I like doing stuff that's a little bit different. I think you want to have a point of difference to appeal to people, to say, hey, what about this?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think did I cover all four? So it's an unequal world. It's a small crew of misfits, and then the area which is called the Hope Cluster, because they travelled there on sleeper ships from Earth, hoping to find a new place to live. So the area of space is called the Hope Cluster, and then Apes in Space. So those are the four axes, and you blend all those together, and you get Sapience.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's such a fun setup. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the indie tabletop role-playing game scene, but I feel like they're taking a lot more of these bigger, almost fun risks, but they also add to telling, like you said, a reflection of society right now.
Yeah.
And obviously this is partially just due to the state of the world, but do you have any reason why you think that tabletop role-playing games specifically have been doing this recently?
I think that, one thing that anybody who gets into the role-playing scene, one thing that they'll find, and it's something that I'm reasonably familiar with role-playing and with role-playing people, I like to think, but something that really struck me, particularly when I got into... So I only got into Twitter a few months ago, and the thing that I found was people in the TTRPGs really are just an amazing, inclusive group of people. It's an incredible community of very, very supportive people, and I think it's also a community of people who are quite aware and who are intelligent enough, or perhaps that's not quite the right word, but maybe socially aware enough to have made themselves understand what's going on. They're aware of what's going on in the world. We know that there are problems. These problems are becoming a lot more visible, mostly due to social media.
Yeah.
We've got protests in the streets. We've got, the Black Lives Matter movement has sprung up in the last, or become certainly a lot more visible in the last year or so.
Yeah.
After some horrible things that have been happening in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And people are aware of that, and certainly in the TTRPG space, very aware and very concerned about it, I think. And it's something that we all need to be thinking about. It's not something that we can sweep under the rug as a society, and we've been doing
not at all.
that for a really long time. And I see this as a amazing group of people collectively who really actually do care about that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, my game's not unique in that I think a lot of people are starting to explore these things and starting to be concerned and interested in these things when they might not have been before. And that can only be a good thing, because the more we can make people aware of the problems that we're facing, the more conscious people are of them, then the more we will start to work through them. And you've got to remember, this is an industry this is a collection of people who, 30 years ago were going through the satanic panic, right? And having their D&D books burned by their parents because they were teaching them how to summon demons and stuff. And
yeah.
And 30 years later, here's this group of just amazing individuals who care about the world and care about others. It's fantastic. It's a great community. I'm so happy to be part of it.
Yeah, it's a huge shift, and I think it's all the better for it. I know that I'm having this conversation because that shift happened.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate about the world's state, and I'm hopeful that we can really explore some of these subjects through that, especially for people who might be a little resistant to it but are trying to learn.
Yeah, and it's something, I mean, the hints have been around for a long time. When I was sort of doing my research before I started the book, you look into Terminator and you might think that Terminator and sort of Terminator 2 was a warning about AI and so forth. It really wasn't. James Cameron said the whole reason that the villain in Terminator 2 was a cop was because there's a whole quote by him, and I don't remember it verbatim, but he basically said cops treat all people who aren't them as less than them, and something to be feared, and something to be concerned about, and something to be put in its place, right? And this was 30 years ago he was saying this. It was the same year that the Rodney King assault happened. Right back then, people were aware that there were endemic problems in the US police force. And 30 years later, we get to, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of the other just horrible shit, especially in the last year. Seems that we're just hearing about this stuff more and more. People are becoming more aware of it now. And it's something that we need to be. It's endemic, and it's something that we need to be focusing on and trying to solve as a society. The problem isn't let's all hate police, right? That's not the problem. But the problem is that there are endemic issues that have become baked in to certain facets of society, and we need to pick them apart and say, well, actually, we should be better than that now.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go over something that's been happening for the past year, only really year 2 now, I guess. COVID.
Yeah.
How has that fun subject? How has that affected the development of Sapience?
I don't want to make it sound like a positive thing. COVID is horrible. For Sapience itself, it actually we probably wouldn't be having this conversation without COVID. To be honest, it gave me a lot more time. So I'm. This is what I was talking about privilege before. I'm in the privileged position to live in a country where we've had, I'm pretty sure the number is 24 deaths ever from COVID, right?
Yeah.
In the States, I'm hearing 3,000 a day at one point.
Yeah, they're up there now.
Yeah, our government a little over a year ago, we had our first few deaths, and our government said, well, that's not happening. Shut down, and we shut down the country for a month. Nobody left their houses. We had food delivered. We just closed the country. And we pretty much killed COVID in its tracks, and I don't think we've had another death since then.
Mm-hmm.
We occasionally have a case pop up because somebody's come in from overseas with it, but other than that, it hasn't been much of a factor in our lives here. But what it did do, and I don't say that to be boastful or anything. I
No,
just
no, of course not.
I'm incredibly lucky that our government took it so seriously, and I wish certain other countries had done the
Yeah.
same thing. But what we did do is we all said, okay, so how are we going to? This can be a thing. This might be a thing for a long time. How are we going to fix this? And a lot of companies said, let's all start working from home. And so I currently work from home. I manage a team. They all work from home as well. We meet up one day a week in an office to have sort of one-on-one conversations and team conversations. And other than that, we all remotely. And that, from the point of view of having time to work on personal projects, which obviously Sapience very much was a personal project, I save 2 hours a day of commuting. So that's 2 hours extra a day that I can be writing. If I'm going to take a lunch break or a coffee break, I can just start writing. I've got a lot more time that I would have had sitting in a car or sitting staring at a wall at work while I munch a sandwich or something like that. So really, I mean, I've been sort of plinking away at Sapience for years, but the bulk of the development really has happened in the last 12 months. And it's just because I've had that bit of extra time. When you're not leaving your house for a month, and
Yep.
there's only so much you can do on each one thing, and so hey, here's some time just to sit there and actually develop and get stuff done, and you can still collaborate with others. I've got a group of really excellent friends who are gamers as well, and collaborated with them a lot and play testing and so forth on the game. So COVID from that point of view benefited Sapience, and I don't say that in any way to say that COVID was a good thing, but
You know what, Brian? I want you to just like right off the hop here. I don't want you to feel guilty about that. That has been the response I have more or less gotten from every single person on this show so far.
well, there you go. It gave us back time. Yeah.
Yeah, it did. It definitely gave people a lot of time to work on personal projects, and that's actually the root of how this podcast came to be, was because I started seeing all these really cool projects and I wanted to make sure that people could also see them.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time here, Brian, but I was wondering if we could ask one more question here.
Yeah, sure.
If you are talking with somebody who has never created a game on their own, they don't have a whole lot of experience, they have an idea for something, but they don't exactly know where to begin making their own tabletop role-playing game or video game or something of that kind, what advice might you give a first-time designer looking to start?
I think you really want to be passionate about your thing, whatever your thing might be. If you don't have a deep set passion for it, why would you expect anybody else is going to? So for me, that's the biggest thing. It's got to be something that you're really engaged and interested in. But at the same time, you've got to make sure that it's going to be something that other people are going to be interested in as well. Any time a company's bringing any kind of product to market, they do their market research, because there's no point making something that only the designer or developer is going to be interested in, right? So try and so GNS theory that I touched on earlier, written by Ron Edwards back in the day, talks about fantasy heartbreakers and how all people who, when they first start thinking about making role-playing games, the first thing they always make is a fantasy heartbreaker, right? They've been playing D&D perhaps, and they say, "Oh, that's an excellent game and I love it, but here's this one thing that would make it better, and I can do that." You have to think about the fact that that's cool, and that might be great, and that might be something that you and your group will love. But if your goal is to make something that you're hoping to find a wider audience for, whatever your motivations for that might be, it certainly doesn't have to be financial. It might just be that you want to talk to other people.
Yeah.
You've got to do something that other people are going to find interesting, and that may not be your Dungeons and Dragons with the serial numbers filed off, right? So find something that you can be passionate about, but perhaps that has a point of difference, or something that you can see that other people might be interested in, and engage other people. Use things like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook to find other role players and talk to other role players, and see where there might be a niche or an area that hasn't been explored or hasn't been heavily explored, that people might say, "Oh yeah, that's interesting. That's a cool concept. I'd like to know more about that." And if there's one thing that I've heard a lot when I've been talking to people about Sapience, which is just a fantastic thing to hear, is they say, "Oh, that's I haven't really heard that kind of thing before. That's interesting. I'm interested to know more about that." Right? And that's the reaction that you want to get from people.
Mm-hmm.
So don't make a fantasy heartbreaker, or do make a fantasy heartbreaker, but accept that that's what you're making, and then you can move past it, and then actually think about, so what am I going to do that's going to be interesting, that's not necessarily just treading all the same ground that somebody's done before, except that my elves are, I don't know, blue or whatever, right? So do something a little bit different that people are going to find engaging, that they're going to see that point of difference and say, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that slant on something. I'd like to know more. I'm interested in playing that game, right? And be passionate about it yourself, because if you're not 100% engaged and passionate about something, nobody else is going to. They might have a spark of interest, but what's going to blow on that spark is going to be your enthusiasm and your drive and your desire to see them enjoy it. And that's what's going to make a good game, I think.
That's phenomenal advice. We're kind of at the end of our show here, Brian, but could you tell the audience where they can find more about you and Sapience?
Yeah, sure. So I think when this comes out, I think the Kickstarter will be running.
Yes, it will be.
Yep. So if you go to Kickstarter, I mean, I'm not going to read out the whole URL because it's really long, but if you go to Kickstarter and search for Sapience, it should come up as a currently running thing. If you're listening to this through the month of June, because June is the month that it's running. If it's after that, you'll find it on DriveThruRPG. I also have a web page, which is www.sapiencerpg.com. That web page has links to the Kickstarter campaign. It's got a lot of information about the game. It's got an online die roller, so the die system that we just talked about. If you want to actually see how it kind of works, if you go to that URL, I built an online die roll. It's all graphical. Actually, you can see the dice all rolling and everything. It's pretty cool, I think. And I'll be releasing that for iOS and Android and Windows after the Kickstarter, if it succeeds.
Oh, perfect.
And then there's a resources page on there, which at the moment is password protected, but once the campaign happens, people will be able to get at that. And there's going to be a ton of stuff on there that people can download, battle maps for all the different spaceships and all the other kind of stuff on there as well. So that's probably a good place to go if you want to find information about the game. And I'm quite happy for people to email me. Feel free to put my email address with this podcast, and if people want to email me and ask me any questions, it's just bleybourne@gmail.com. Feel free to get in touch. Yeah.
Perfect. Those will all be down in the description below, including the Kickstarter. And I'm going to go say, back this game. I want to play this game so bad. And I just this is one of my major looking forward to hits from the tabletop role-playing game community.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I hope people find something to like about my game, whether it be, any of the sort of aspects that we've talked about. Hopefully, there's something in there for everybody to go, oh, that's interesting, and I'd love to, anyone, if anyone's listening and they get the game and they play it, please get in touch and tell me what you think. I'd love to have feedback. I'd love to hear from people and discuss how they found the game and what they thought of it, and so on.
Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. Brian, thank you so much for coming on to the show tonight.
Thanks, Zach. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been great. And thank you, audience, for listening. Brian and Sapience are scheduled to launch very soon. Thank you so much to Brian for coming onto the show this week. It was a really good conversation, and he's incredibly knowledgeable about a lot of different topics, so go pick his brain while you have the chance. More importantly this week, though, thank you to you. This is the 10th episode scheduled for launch, and without the kind words I've received and the support, I doubt I would have gone this far. If you like the show and you want to see more or hear more, please consider rating and reviewing us somewhere, or letting me know what you think with one of the socials below. Truly, thank you so much for listening, and I really hope I get to continue doing this for a really long time. Take care now. Have a good night. I'll see you next week.